Hey, I'm Amy with Creative Catapult Coaching, and drawing my focus back here is it was on timers.
And I'm Megan with Focus Like a Mother, and this is the Control Alt Think podcast, Conversations with Neurodivergent Minds. And today we are diving into deadlines and a little bit about transitions and how those are kind of also associated with deadlines. So, since you started in timers, Amy, what do we got?
We have a timer.
We,
Okay.
we have our own deadline. So, every time we record a podcast episode, we freeform it. So we are not going off of any script or any preconceived anything other than we come in with, hey, this is the topic we want to talk about. Um, but I always have a little stopwatch app going in Zoom, which is how we record this. And so that way I can keep track of the time so that hopefully we don't ramble too much. And today Amy has her own visual timer, which is very similar to what I have in my house, which is called a time timer. So if anybody's looking for a visual timer, the time timer brand ones are pretty awesome and you can get them on Amazon.
Yep.
But that is
Time
our,
timer has been around for a long time, but
yes,
um, I'm gonna steal this right now. I've
go.
been doing a lot of energy management in the last couple weeks to manage my thinking, but also to help me manage my deadlines and energy management and all of that is something, a deadline really is just a time that something needs to be done, or it's a way to help organize our time and space. Sometimes they're real formal, like I've got a presentation in 2 days and because I'm gonna be there, if the presentation isn't done, I don't get to work on it afterwards. So there's an external deadline that sort of prompted this. I know, Megan, you've got some papers coming up that are part of your deadline cycle right now. And
Mm-hmm.
both of us have to manage time and energy in relation to hitting these things so that we can do some of the stuff that either we're expected to or we've set out for ourselves.
Yeah, and I think deadlines is a very common thing for neurodivergent people, especially. A lot of times feeling like we have a deadline or like I can get a lot more done closer to the deadline when it's approaching. Although I had a deadline fail last week. So Amy knows this because we trade off which one of us, you'll remember in a
Oh,
second, we
yes.
trade
No, I
off which
remember.
one of
I was
us
like, wait, what?
posts the episode. And last week was my week to post. And I was busy with my other deadlines and totally forgot, even though I had already processed the video and everything and just had the transcript piece remaining. And I realized on Thursday morning, or yeah, Thursday morning, and was like, oh, I need to post that. Here, let me go do that. So, one, I missed the deadline, but then on top of that, I could not for the life of me get YouTube um Studio to work right to get it to post. So I actually was sending Amy a text the day after the deadline of when in theory we were 3 weeks ahead and we have some of our stuff posted, but it was this one got hung up in processing and I didn't get it out there. Um so yeah, deadlines for me are very motivating, um, but they can also almost be demotivating. So if it's an internal deadline and not an external expectation, and something comes up or happens or whatever, and I miss the deadline, there are times that my brain is almost like, well, that's done, that's gone, we've missed it, and the brain has moved on, but the thing never actually got done.
Yeah.
So it
And I
it's a
think a
wild
lot of
time.
well, and I think for a lot of people, there's a certain amount of urgency, which is, closer to fight or flight that can make it super effective when balanced right. But that urgency lends closer to some of the brain stuff kicking online, and it's like suddenly all of the in many ways, the resistance lowers. And I spend plenty of time talking with people about ways to motivate themselves for deadlines beyond just urgency. But the world keeps throwing deadlines at us, and I think part of growing up and being adults, terrible word that is, also includes choosing which deadlines are we going to accept.
Mm. Hmm. And since you mentioned urgency, one of the methods that I used to use and teach, well, I still use, but used to teach in some of my corporate training classes on prioritizing is the Eisenhower method. So, is it urgent? Is it important? And I see Amy smiling there, so she knows that one too. But you mentioned urgency. The other thing is importance. But then another thing for me that doesn't fit in that 2x2 matrix is how interesting is it? So
And
I'm
that's
much more
classic
likely to hit a deadline if
neurodivergent.
it's something I'm excited about.
Yeah, well, I think it's normal, but one of the known pieces for a lot of the neurodivergence, ADHD specifically, is that we're an interest-based nervous system. So when we've got resources, we can use something like an Eisenhower matrix to help us prioritize, from a logical standpoint, what's important and what's urgent. But important is often external standards, not necessarily what's important slash interesting to us.
Hmm.
And there are times that we definitely have to, pay rent. I'm not
Hmm.
really interested or motivated, specifically by rent, other than the fact that if I don't have a place to live.
Hmm.
Uh, that's probably not a great example, but a lot of deadlines or things when I've worked for other people weren't necessarily things that I found that important, but my job kind of depended on them. So as we got to a sense of urgency, they became motivating. But
Hmm.
as I was in other places, yeah, deadlines and the Eisenhower matrix is a great tool for using a rational standpoint, but ultimately for an interest-based nervous system, there's going to be a point where, especially if we're not under dire consequence or dramatically overwhelmed, interest will win.
Hmm.
And so how to balance interest-based deadlines using external accountability as well as internal interest isn't, and fatigue. I mean, frankly, I'm realizing when I'm tired, nothing happens.
Hmm. Yeah, I know a lot of people that I've actually had a couple people say this to me in the last couple weeks, is that they hit a certain point in the day and they're just done. Like nothing else can happen.
And yeah, for me with the energy management, I've really pulled back and really started resting a lot more, which has been great, except then it's so easy. I'm so used to running on pretty close to empty that it's just easy for me to keep going and, remember that I have to stop and rest intentionally or I lose that edge I've built up.
Hmm.
And so for me, a lot of the work I've done with people is going, what do you know about your energy management? When is it going to be realistic to work on this project or this thing? Because there is a deadline and you probably, both have some interest and some need to hit it. And how are you going to make that happen, especially with the long-term, you know, planning and urgency and reward that, if you're time blind, it's hard to imagine that project being completed in 6 or 8 months or a week or later in the day, depending on levels of things. And so how do you manage other resources to hit the deadline?
Mm. When you mentioned deadlines are also being imposed on us, and which ones do we decide to accept? And that's something I had to learn when I worked for other people was being able to know which deadlines would be acceptable and would work for me, and which deadlines I may need to push back on, and it might not be well received, and I may have to navigate that path of someone else's expectations with this deadline versus other times when I could say the deadline wasn't going to work and push on it and it would be okay. So there are just lots of different things to navigate when there's a deadline involved, especially if it's an external deadline and not one that you've given yourself. Um, and there's also things to navigate with the deadlines you've given yourself as well. So I try to make my internal deadlines sometimes external. So I will tell someone else about it, or I will make it so I need to show something to someone else. So, oh, Amy, I'm gonna finish my paper on by this day so that you have time to review it. The most notable one I know from this year in my life was I had to give a presentation at a Rotary Club. And so I told the organizer that I would have the presentation to them, I think like 2 weeks ahead of time, which was an internal deadline for myself. That's not when they wanted it by, but by telling them, I then made it external. But it was my own kind of internally negotiated deadline. And that way I knew it would be motivating. And then I'd also have time to adjust if it wasn't going to work before the final deadline of, hey, I got to give this presentation.
Well, and I
So,
think you're onto something really useful right there is how can you externalize some of those deadlines in a way that ends up feeling acceptable. There's a lot in the neurodivergence, of that energy from somebody else and using it to help yourself meet your own deadlines.
mhm.
Kind of like you giving that Rotary presentation, or I'm having to think about what accommodations would be or differences would be something that, business leaders could enact for this presentation. And part of it really is, you know, how do you help the person set a deadline and check with them on it, but don't make it be micromanaging. It's an
Mhm.
odd line to try and walk with somebody else. I was never terribly successful in reverse implementing it when I had a supervisor and was just learning about my own ADHD, but I didn't have a lot of the skill and nuance I do now.
Mm. Yeah, because the thing that is kind of going unsaid there is the pressure that comes with the deadline, the expectation. If it comes across as a demand, then having a deadline is kind of a very fine line. If it goes a little too far and it feels too demanding, it almost kind of shuts the motivation down in some people. I know that it happens that way for me, where if I feel like it's an expectation or a demand, all of a sudden I have a lot more trouble getting motivated to do it, even though there is a deadline. So it's like that fight or flight starts to become more of a panic instead of motivating.
Yeah, when I think again, it's an interesting distinction. Is it demand avoidance or is it overwhelm? Because they're not the same.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they both occur at the same time, but they're really, you cannot want to do something because somebody told you to do it
Mm-hmm.
and have a lot of energy or no energy, and you can be overwhelmed and not know where to start staring at the same deadline, but you'd be happy to get started if you weren't panicking.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so again, just difference and nuance in kind of our reactions as we approach deadlines and work that we may or may not be able to do.
Well, with that, since I'm looking at our timer, um, getting close to the end of our time, what uh what are you going to do with your own deadlines this week, Amy?
I'm gonna be resting actually. So I have flown through my presentation updates this morning. I originally had somebody help me draft it, so I had to go back and fill in some things. When I'm rested, I can, oh my gosh, I like, oh, I remember that other presentation I saw from another professional organization that has all the facts and all the things in it I need. I can just pop those into my presentation instead of all of the agonizing and distress and, racking my brain that I do when I'm not rested.
Mm.
Right now, I have access to all the information in my brain, which is usually where to find what I'm looking for, not necessarily all of the information in and of itself, but my flexibility and my creativity are far better. And so much of the challenge for me right now is remembering that slowing down actually lets me speed up. And that's been one of those things I've used off and on for years, slow down to speed up.
Mm. So as you get closer to your deadline, it sounds like you're being more deliberate in resting and doing very intentional things to prepare.
Yes, and I have the luxury of this is almost done. It's also not a super high stakes presentation or outside deadline. And it's nice to be in that space for once.
Mm.
How about yourself and your deadlines for the week?
So I've got some external deadlines, and I've really just got to wrap up and kind of put the bow on everything for all of my different research papers. And it definitely went from a case of overwhelm to where I just wasn't sure where to start because it was a little vague. Um, to now I have a very clear kind of put together thread across all of my papers, and I have a direction that I know I'm going in. So it's really just buttoning up everything. But I did not intend to get this close to my deadline. I had planned on having it done long, long ago. But the nice thing has been that in getting so kind of engrossed and deep into all of the information that I'm working on for this, it's actually been really fun and has started a lot of other thoughts. Um, so hopefully out of this, I'll have some springboards into some other ideas.
Well, it sounds like you've got some of your own strategies worked out. Some are similar to mine, some are a bit different. And sounds like you're employing another one of my favorite acronyms. Not that I think I've shared it with you, maybe, but GEMO, good enough, move on.
Yes.
You've reached the point where you can GEMO things.
Yes. Yes. Because with writing, you can always make changes. And so it's kind of, nope, if I make any more changes, it's my word count's going to go up, and it's at a very nice balance. It's almost like a little teeter-totter, and I've leveled it, and I just need to let it be.
All right,
So,
well, it sounds like a good thought process, whether or not the beeping caught. The timer ran
oh,
out
I
of
didn't hear
time.
the timer. Our timer
The
has,
computers are actually often quite good at filtering out background noise, but because we set a deadline or an intention of 15 minutes for ourselves, and then the intent to wrap up, we're gonna again sort of freeform using our tools. Call this.
all right.
There's always more we could say, but we're at good enough, move on.
Yes. All right. Well, this is Megan with Focus Like a Mother.
And Amy with Creative Catapult Coaching. And this is the Control Alt Think podcast, Conversations with Neurodivergent Minds.
We'll see everybody next time.
See ya.